The Mongol Empire had never known failure on this scale. By 1240, their armies had shattered every military force they encountered across 2 continents. Chinese dynasties crumbled, Persian cities burned, Russian principalities surrendered without meaningful resistance. The Mongol war machine operated with mechanical efficiency, destroying armies that outnumbered them, conquering territories that seemed unconquerable, and leaving behind administrative systems that turned defeated enemies into productive tributaries. They had refined warfare into a science, and that science had never produced an incorrect result, until they reached the frozen forests of northeastern Europe, where men who refused to understand their own obsolescence were waiting. The Mongols, who approached Scandinavian territories in 1240, were not exploratory scouts. They were the western extension of an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Poland. These were veteran soldiers who had participated in the siege of Kiev, the destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire, and the subjugation of the Rus principalities. They understood siege warfare, open-field tactics, psychological operations, and the systematic dismantling of enemy morale. They had developed strategies for every terrain type, every climate condition, and every form of military resistance they had previously encountered. They brought this accumulated expertise to the northern campaigns with complete confidence in its universal applicability. The Vikings they encountered were not the raiders of popular imagination. By 1240, the age of coastal raids and monastery plundering had largely concluded. These were settled warriors, farmers who maintained martial traditions, traders who understood networks of exchange across brutal distances, and sailors whose navigation skills exceeded anything the Mongols had encountered. They lived in communities that valued individual combat prowess, maintained oral traditions of tactical knowledge, and possessed intimate familiarity with environments that killed outsiders through simple exposure. They were not organized into the centralized military structures the Mongols had learned to exploit. They were distributed, autonomous, and dangerously unpredictable. The initial Mongol approach followed their standard reconnaissance protocol. Advance units moved through territories gathering intelligence on population centers, resource distribution, political structures, and military capabilities. They identified settlements, estimated fighting-age male populations, assessed fortification quality, and mapped escape routes. This information fed back to commanders who would formulate conquest strategies based on proven methodologies. The system had worked across Asia. It had worked across the Middle East. It had worked across Eastern Europe. But the data returning from Scandinavian reconnaissance created patterns that didn't match existing templates. The settlements were scattered rather than concentrated. Political authority was fragmented rather than centralized. Military forces were decentralized rather than organized into armies. There was no single ruler to threaten, no capital city to besiege, no concentrated wealth to seize. The standard Mongol strategy of decapitation strikes against leadership structures had no clear target. You cannot behead a hydra. You cannot negotiate with a distributed network. You cannot demonstrate overwhelming force to an enemy that has no center to overwhelm. The Mongol commanders adapted. If traditional conquest methodology wouldn't apply, They would use the universal language of violence. They would burn settlements until submission became preferable to resistance. They would demonstrate the cost of opposition through systematic destruction. They would create refugees whose testimony would spread fear faster than armies could march. This had worked before. It would work again. The first Mongol force entered a coastal settlement expecting minimal resistance. The population should have fled or surrendered. Instead, they fortified. Viking defenders used terrain the Mongols hadn't properly assessed. The settlement backed against cliffs that prevented cavalry maneuvers. Approaches funneled through narrow passages where Mongol numerical advantages became irrelevant. Buildings were constructed from materials that resisted the fire arrows that had proven so effective against wooden Asian structures. The architecture itself was defensive in ways the Mongols hadn't encountered. The fighting began at dawn. Mongol archers, among the most skilled in the world, launched volleys designed to suppress defender movements and create panic. Viking warriors responded not with panic, but with coordinated defensive fire from protected positions. They weren't trying to win an archery duel. They were forcing the Mongols into closer engagement, where different rules applied. Mongol cavalry attempted to flank through coastal approaches. They encountered Viking ships, not fleeing, but positioned as mobile platforms for archers and spear throwers, who understood water-based combat in ways the steppe warriors didn't. Horses that were assets on open plains became liabilities on rocky shorelines. Mongol riders who were unstoppable on flat terrain found themselves vulnerable on uneven ground, where their mounts couldn't generate the momentum that made their charges devastating. The battle condensed into brutal close-quarters fighting. This was not the Mongols' preferred mode of warfare. Their strength lay in mobility, archery, and psychological intimidation. They excelled at creating chaos and exploiting it. Viking defenders countered with a fighting style built for individual combat. They wielded axes designed to break shields and armor. They used their environmental knowledge to create choke points where Mongol numbers became disadvantages. They fought with the desperation of men defending not an empire, but their families, their homes, their specific pieces of earth. By nightfall, the Mongol force withdrew. This was unusual, but not unprecedented. They would regroup, reassess, and return with adjusted tactics. Except they didn't. The coastal settlement had cost them more casualties than anticipated. The Viking resistance had been more competent than intelligence suggested. The terrain had been more disadvantageous than reconnaissance indicated. The cost-benefit analysis that guided Mongol expansion was producing uncomfortable numbers. Mongol military doctrine included sophisticated logistical calculations. They could sustain armies across vast distances because they understood supply chain mathematics. Every campaign was evaluated not just on military feasibility, but on resource efficiency. The Mongol Empire expanded where expansion made economic sense. They conquered territories that could be administered profitably. They destroyed civilizations that resisted, but they absorbed civilizations that submitted, because absorption generated tribute that funded further expansion. Scandinavia was presenting a different equation. The scattered settlements meant extended campaigns. The terrain favored defenders. The climate created supply challenges. The population was distributed in ways that made total conquest require resource investments that exceeded probable returns. And the Vikings were demonstrating a willingness to fight that exceeded their strategic value as conquests. A second Mongol force approached a different settlement, attempting a modified strategy. Instead of direct assault, they attempted siege tactics. They surrounded the settlement and waited for supplies to diminish. This had worked against fortified cities across Asia. It failed against Vikings, who had built their entire culture around surviving harsh conditions with limited resources. Settlements that could endure 6-month winters could endure Mongol siege timelines. Defenders who lived on preserved fish and stored grains weren't going to surrender because of food shortages. The Mongols escalated. They began systematic destruction of outlying farms and food stores. They killed livestock. They burned fields. They attempted to create conditions where surrender became survival's only option. Viking response was to intensify resistance. Small raiding parties emerged from forests and attacked Mongol supply lines. They used their knowledge of terrain to strike and disappear. They employed tactics that the Mongols normally used against enemies: mobility and unpredictability, combined with intimate environmental knowledge. The Mongol advantages were eroding. Their cavalry superiority meant nothing in dense forests. Their archery skills were countered by opponents using similar weapons from protected positions. Their numerical strength was diluted across territory that couldn't support concentrated forces. Their psychological warfare tactics failed against enemies who viewed death in battle as culturally acceptable, even honorable. A third confrontation occurred on more open ground, where Mongol doctrine should have prevailed. A Viking force positioned itself on a plain that seemed to offer the Mongols every advantage. The commanders recognized this might be a trap, but calculated their mobility would allow them to exploit any opening or retreat if necessary. They attacked at their preferred pace with their preferred tactics. The Vikings had prepared the battlefield. Hidden pits disrupted cavalry charges. Concealed archers waited in tree lines. The open ground that appeared advantageous was actually a killing field designed to channel Mongol forces into predetermined zones. When the Mongols committed to their charge, they found themselves in a coordinated ambush executed by warriors who understood that they couldn't match Mongol mobility or numbers, but could match Mongol tactical sophistication when defending prepared positions. The fighting lasted hours. Mongol forces attempted their standard tactical flexibility, probing for weaknesses and exploiting openings. Viking defenders maintained their positions and forced the battle into the close-range brutality where their fighting style was most effective. Axes met composite bows. Individual combat skills met coordinated cavalry tactics. Neither side gained decisive advantage. The Mongol withdrawal from this engagement was different. It wasn't a tactical repositioning. It was a strategic reassessment. The commanders who had conquered from China to Hungary were facing an opponent that didn't fit their operational models. The Vikings weren't a superior military force. They were an incompatible military force. The Mongol system was designed to conquer empires, not to subjugate distributed warrior cultures that had no centralized authority to break and no concentrated wealth to seize. The economic mathematics became undeniable. Further campaigns into Scandinavian territories would require extended commitments of forces that were needed elsewhere. The probable returns, tribute, territory, resources, didn't justify the certain costs. The Mongol Empire operated on conquest efficiency. They destroyed empires because destroying empires made strategic sense. Destroying the Vikings didn't. The Mongol withdrawal from Scandinavian campaigns in 1240 wasn't a military defeat in the traditional sense. They weren't routed from the field. They weren't forced to retreat by superior enemy forces. They made a calculated decision that continued expansion in that direction failed their cost-benefit analysis. But the result was the same. The unstoppable force stopped. News of the Mongol withdrawal spread across Europe differently than news of Mongol conquests. When the Mongols destroyed cities, survivors carried tales of overwhelming power and inevitable submission. When the Mongols withdrew from Scandinavia, the narrative was different. A distributed warrior culture with no empire to defend had simply refused to be conquered efficiently. They hadn't matched Mongol military superiority. They'd made Mongol military superiority irrelevant. The Vikings didn't celebrate a great victory because they didn't view it as such. They'd defended their settlements. They'd maintained their autonomy. They'd done what they'd always done, survived in environments that killed others and fought when survival required fighting. The concept that they'd accomplished something historically significant didn't register, because from their perspective, they'd simply continued being Vikings. But the historical significance was undeniable. The Mongol Empire that had destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire, conquered the Jin dynasty, and subjugated Kievan Rus, had encountered an opponent whose very structure made them unconquerable by Mongol methods. The military system that had proven universally effective across two continents had found its limitation not in superior force, but in incompatible organization. The forgotten Battle of 1240 wasn't a single engagement. It was a series of confrontations that collectively demonstrated that the Mongol war machine, for all its sophistication and power, required certain conditions to function. It required centralized enemies. It required concentrated populations. It required territories where control of specific locations meant control of entire regions. Against an enemy that provided none of these conditions, against warriors who were distributed, autonomous, and willing to fight indefinitely for land that held no strategic value to empire builders. The Mongol system had no effective response. The Vikings survived not because they were stronger, but because they were structurally unconquerable by an empire that had perfected the art of conquering empires. They were the exception that proved the rule. The Mongol military system was devastatingly effective against any organized state, but against men who recognized no state, who answered to no central authority, who defended not an empire, but individual communities scattered across terrain that punished invaders. The most successful military force in human history simply calculated the cost and moved on. History remembers the Mongol conquests. It forgets the Mongol withdrawals. But the withdrawal from Scandinavia in 1240 revealed something about power that empires never want to acknowledge. Sometimes the strongest force doesn't win. Sometimes it just decides the fight isn't worth having, and sometimes a group of scattered warriors with no empire to their name accomplish what great civilizations could not. They make conquest too expensive to be worth the effort. The Mongols went on to conquer more territory. The Vikings continued being Vikings, and the battle that never became famous remained the answer to a question empires hate to ask. What happens when unstoppable force meets immovable object? Sometimes the unstoppable force does the math and chooses a different direction.